Excerpts from Physics Division Field Manual 13, Special Circumstances, Humanoid Threat Entities. Type Blue, Thaumatologists. Introduction. Thaumatologists, type Blue, have numerous names, including witches, wizards, sorcerers, magicians, miracle workers, and occultists. It doesn't matter what they are called because they all inherently do the same thing. Utilize thaumaturgy, which, as many of you may know, is colloquially known as magic. For this very reason, type Blues have two characteristics that make them one of the most difficult threats to deal with. One is their difficulty to be identified. Even with the most advanced techniques and technology, type Blues are often mistaken for other threat entities, especially type Greens. In fact, it isn't uncommon for threat entities to be both a type Blue and another type, such as a yellow or a cyan, as thaumaturgy is a common starting point for many capabilities. The other is their versatility. Most types tend to follow a basic pattern of behavior or methodology, which makes them easy to deal with. Blue's behavior entirely depends on several factors, since thaumaturgy itself has so many different practices, techniques, and effects. Usually, Blues will specialize in specific genres of thaumaturgy, such as elemental manipulation, special temporal alteration, or metamorphosis. Though Blues also tend to be experimental and inventive, and will often branch out of their common practices to learn new methods or create new ones. Even with these difficulties, there are means to deliberate, dampen, and liquidate type Blues. Class. All type Blues fall into one of three categories known as classes, though there have been cases where subjects have been classed as two or even all three other categories. However, most subjects will be classified as Scholar, the most common type of Blues and can be the hardest to deal with. Scholars are typically ordinary individuals who have acquired thaumatological capabilities through study and research. In most cases, the designation Scholar is somewhat undeserved, with most scholars merely wishing to acquire power and skills quickly and without careful effort, resulting in them having poor understanding and control over their thaumatological capabilities and their effects. This makes these types of scholars rather easy to deal with. However, those who are of more academic or patient character can be more of a challenge. These kinds of scholars are careful with their development, rigorously researching and experimenting rather than rushing. Because of this, they are much more powerful and usually more creative with their capabilities. That isn't to say they aren't all difficult to deal with, as these individuals usually, if not too power-hungry or obsessive, are open to deliberation and discussion. The Wielder. The most unusual of Blues, but usually the easiest to deal with. Wielders' thaumatological capabilities do not actually come from the individual themselves, but rather from a bond they formed with another entity, usually a Gudric, Templum, Kapala, or Ex Machina threat entity. In a sense, wielders merely channel and output the capabilities of the bonded entity. Often, if the wielder is of weak constitution or character, they will inevitably end up submitting to the will of said entity. Gifted. The rarest of Blues and the hardest to identify, gifted thaumatological capabilities are innate to their biology, often displaying abilities soon after birth or later in early childhood to late teenage years. This ingrained nature is why gifteds are so hard to identify, with a lot of them getting mistaken for other types of threat entities, usually greens. The exact nature of how a gifted form is not entirely known, though it has been suggested by ICSUT that certain genetic codes develop and mature to enact ritualistic proceedings. To put it in simpler terms, the genes are incantations. Performances. There are several ways to enact thaumaturgy, known as performances, with most subjects preferring one system over another. Each one has to be dealt with differently, with some being easier to counterattack than others. Leitmotif. Thaumaturgy is invoked through the use of speech, phrases, musical sequence, or other forms of auditory output. Mudra. Thaumaturgy is invoked through the use of gestures or movements, ranging from a slight movement of a limb to an entire dance performance. Runic. Thaumaturgy is invoked through the use of symbols, including numbers, letters, words, or sigils. Wish. Thaumaturgy is invoked through mental effort via emotions, memories, or fragments of knowledge. Ritual. Thaumaturgy is invoked using a multiple of the previously mentioned methods. Identification. As previously said, blues are rather difficult to identify. However, there are a few signs that can help to both localize and identify them. All thaumaturgy requires a concentration of Eve or Akiva radiation flux to function, with blues naturally causing a point of focus in this flux. Blues cannot help doing this because as soon as they begin utilizing thaumaturgy, they become attractive to thaumaturgical influence. This focus in the flux can be detected through the use of an etheric resonance imagery, ERI, like the Veritas. However, this method is not foolproof. Should the environment already be high in flux, blues of insubstantial capabilities and strength will not make a prominent focus. Therefore, the use of ERIs is useful for localizing blues, but more in-depth investigation is required to actually triangulate the individual. In the case of scholars and wielder, subjects can typically be found in locations or areas of historical, cultural, religious, or educational value. The renowned extra-dimensional location known as the Wanderer's Library is one of these locations, with many blues using the location to expand their capabilities and influence. They also are likely to have established or attempted to establish relations with already known parathreats and organizations, such as the Serpent's Hand and Marshall, Carter, and Dark Limited. Vulnerabilities. There are a few ways of dealing with all classes of blues, but in some cases, assessment and strike teams must undertake precise measures for different classes. Iron and silver. As had been known for millennia, iron and silver have the unusual property of redirecting and negating thaumaturgical effects, making them perfect for conflict with any blue. If such materials are unavailable, compounds made up of either metals, such as steel, sterling, or electrum, can be effective, though not nearly as effective as their pure forms. Cold iron is the standard material used to combat blues, so strike teams will often utilize ice bear traps to subdue objects or ochre bullets if termination is required. In the cases where the subject requires at least response level 4, strike teams are permitted to use malachite bullets. Mark V Hopeless Elderwood Iron Ammunition malachite bullets, composed of a bronze jacket and alderwood iron core. Counter saturation. Eve and Akiva radiation is a very responsive force, and just like a metal to a magnet, will gravitate to the most attractive, powerful subject. In most cases, whilst they are a threat, Most blues will be relatively weak or inexperienced. Therefore, should two blues come to face one another, the flux will tend to gravitate to whichever subject holds the most powerful capabilities. Locomotion. In some cases, blues maintain strength so long as they remain in proximity of a location, so forcing the subject to move location can have beneficial results. Not only is this because it forces subjects to reassess their resources and surroundings, distracting them from performing, but it can also cause a shock to their system if the flux they have gotten used to is no longer present. This technique is also effective if the transition is from a rural environment to a more urban one. Urban environments tend to possess higher levels of pollutants or erratic flux, heavily weakening and sometimes killing blues that are not more versed in such environments. Separation. This technique is usually exclusive to wielder class subjects, specifically if they employ a Capella or Gudrick type entity. Since a bond needs to be maintained for the subject to be able to possess their capabilities, separating the subject from their source will halt this. This can be done by actually physically forcing the two entities to separate, or if the threat possesses its own will, incept a doubt or offer to force the threat or subject to abandon their partner. Sensory occlusion. By inhibiting a subject's ability to locate resources and enact their performance, this will render them vulnerable and easier to detain. A simple straitjacket and gag will be able to prevent most motif and mudra performers from enacting any thaumaturgy. This method, whilst quick and easy, isn't always effective, especially against wish performers who don't rely on sensory input. Threat levels and termination. In the majority of cases, blues are identified early in their development and usually, depending on their behavior, performance, and class, will be assigned Response Level 1, Minimal Threat. Should the subject's development continue, two options can be undertaken. Option 1, the ICSUT's rehousing scheme can be employed, and the subject will be transported to the nearest free port, such as 3 Portlands or High Brazil, and required to sign a Geish gag order. This option is often taken by gifted class blues. Option 2 typically occurs if the subject becomes abusive, power-hungry, and uncooperative. Then the subjects will be upgraded to Response Level 2, Submoderate Threat. At this point, assessment and strike teams are deployed, equipped with bronze suits and ice bear traps, and at least one certified operative capable of thaumaturgy to act as a sink. Termination of the subject can be avoided even at this level, however. If the subject's resources become spare, they lose the ability to enact their style of performance, or in the case of wielders, their bond with their entity is severed. Then they can be detained for later liquidation or assessment. If the subject's behavior and capabilities continue to grow more erratic, they are to be further upgraded to Response Level 3, Moderate Threat, and termination must be undertaken. At this point, the use of ochre or malachite bullets is suggested.